A good man is a very dangerous man who has himself under control. And no one ever says that. So you say to young men, look, like, your job is to be as dangerous as you possibly can be in every possible direction, and to control that, right? Not to be harmless and slothful and contemptible even in your own eyes. And that way you get the power of the shadow. You don't have to dispense with the anger and the aggression. You can integrate it. And that's way better. I mean, I had a remarkable conversation with Jocko Willink. I felt that it was remarkable. It was very engrossing. And Willink, he's unlike me in many ways. I mean, he's a physical specimen of sort of unparalleled proportions to begin with. He's about 2 feet thick, you know, and he's this military guy, highly disciplined and also extraordinarily morally integrated. And he's an admirable person because the danger is right there under the surface. But he has it rather than it having him. We're uncomfortable with the idea that that's the proper route for socialization. We try to teach our children that only, cooperative games are acceptable. And they know in their hearts that that's a complete bloody lie. It's not technically sustainable. It's not even conceptually correct. I'm not saying I've solved it. I talk to Bjorn about this a lot. It's like, I love your message. Wouldn't it be wonderful to eradicate absolute poverty? And he does this great job technically of rank ordering global concerns, doing a cost-benefit analysis that's methodologically rigorous and saying, look, we can devote money here. We'll get a 20-to-1 return. It's mostly in child nutrition, as it turns out. Couldn't we do an immense amount of good with targeted spending? And the answer is clearly yes. We could eradicate child poverty in the next 15 years. We probably will. We could do great things, but we don't know how to sell it. And that's a huge problem. I've never had more of a response from a crowd than when I draw a relationship between responsibility and meaning. Without fail, that brings the crowd to silence. And it's because that connection hasn't been made explicit sufficiently, I would say, is that we find meaning in responsibility. And there is a messianic call that's embedded in this. And you can translate that into get yourself together, see what you could become. And, much of Beyond Order is exactly that. It's push your limits, move beyond yourself, discipline yourself, but move beyond that discipline. Don't let that order constrain who you could be, because it's not a high enough order yet. And I would say, it looks like that is attractive to young people, and perhaps specifically to young men, but not only to young men and not only to the young. So, well, that's a problem that we have to address is, we are doing a lot of things right, but it's not romantic enough. The clinical experience and my lecturing experience has been unbelievably positive in the main. And the clinical experience was positive because I was always on the side of the part of the person that was oriented towards their own health and improvement. That was part of our contractual pact. I'd often make that explicit. It's like, I'm not here for unconditional positive regard. I'm on the side of the part of you that wants everything to be better. And we're going to discover where that is, and we're going to work to facilitate it. And people loved that. And it was so gratifying to engage in that work. It was constantly positive. I worked with a huge variety of people, from people who had nothing, no gifts, and were just off the edges of the world, to people who were unbelievably talented and gifted, the whole gamut. And that was absolutely wonderful to see that range of people. And the lecturing has been the same way. Like the lecture tour I did was immensely positive, too much positive even. You wouldn't think that would be possible, but it is possible. And I'm very positively oriented towards human beings in the main, despite I think we're great, flawed and terribly, but no wonder. No wonder. I mean, the burden we bear is absolutely, it's absurd. The existentialists made much of that. We have an absurd existence. We're aware of our own mortality. God, and we're animals. We're aware of our own mortality. What a burden. And yet here we are. And much of the time we're not corrupt and horrible. It's a miracle. One of the things that I puzzled out a long while back and tried to adhere to the best of my ability was driven by exactly the concern that you're expressing, because I realize that the instinct for meaning is a genuine instinct, and it underlies even our attention. It's unbelievably deep. It's the deepest thing about us. Okay, but what about
the search for meaning? That's that, or
the experience
meaning
and the search.
Okay.
Well, I would say both of those. Both of those are they're somewhat independent, because the search for meaning is very motivating, but the experience of meaning is something in and of itself. We talked about that in relationship to the night sky, for example.
Right.
So, okay, but your objection was, well, what if that meaning instinct goes wrong? It's like, yeah, what if? What if? Okay, how do you make it go wrong? Lie and see what happens. Because you'll pathologize that instinct, and then you're lost. So if you understand that, there isn't anything more frightening than understanding that. Because your stability as an entity, as a soul, is dependent on your relationship with that instinct for meaning. And if you pathologize that with deceit, you will find yourself in the hands of things that you do not want to be in the hands of. Put it that way.
But the argument today is there is no truth. Whose truth? That's my truth. It's your truth. I think what you're saying is you find meaning in truth, and if you're lying about something, then that's the absence of truth. But
well, if you tell the truth to the best of your ability, then you can trust your instincts to some degree. To the greatest degree that you're capable of, and then that can help orient you in the world properly. You can rely on your instincts if you don't pathologize the information that you're feeding yourself. So, if you want to live in harmony with yourself, which you would assume to be somewhat desirable rather than
right.
a hellish disharmony, then don't feed yourself what's indigestible, and certainly don't warp the world around you with deceit you know to be deceitful. It's extraordinarily damaging and dangerous. Well, because I realized that the instinct for meaning could become pathologized. That's what made me obsessed to begin with about the spoken word, with free speech, for example. You were also talking about what orients us in the middle. Well, the thing about the middle is where the middle is shifts, because the environment around us shifts, the natural world shifts, the social world shifts, and so that middle moves on us. And so what we do is we talk to each other, which is a form of thinking. Thinking is internalized speech. So the dialogue we're having is thought. If I'm thinking, I just have that dialogue in my head by myself. It's still a dialogue between two viewpoints. So we orient ourselves with untrammeled, honest speech in a constant search to find that optimal middle ground. But it always moves. So we are destined in some sense to continually communicate about where we should be. That's for sure. But the idea that there's a desirable middle that we can attain through dialogue, well, that's a presupposition of Western individualism. So if you buy the idea that our institutions are basically predicated on tyrannical power, so that's the basis for institutional organization, is power. Then you buy the argument that the dialogue between institutions is nothing but the expression of that power. There are no individuals, and there's no space for rational negotiation. And that case is being made constantly, particularly by radicals on the left. It is fundamentally anti-individual. And there is no room in that system for free speech itself. It's not like it's anti-free speech. That's a misconception. Something isn't anti-free speech if it has no room whatsoever for the concept of free speech. That's a much deeper criticism. And that's part of what's driving this identity politics movement. It's an assault on the idea of the individual word, the word itself. It's an assault on the idea of the redemptive power of the word itself. There's no individuals. There's no rational discourse. There's no possibility of meeting in the middle. There's no middle. There's just a territory defined by struggles for power between groups. That's why it's okay not to invite someone who disagrees with you. They don't disagree with you. They represent a different power structure. And you might think you have an opinion, but you don't. you're merely mouthing the platitudes of your social structure. You're not there as an individual, not from that perspective. This is a much more radical critique than people generally realize. It goes all the way to the bottom. So, it's a word of encouragement, and that's what people are responding so positively to in a time where everyone is told this story that, human activity is all a struggle for power, and that we're fundamentally a destructive force, and that we should rein ourselves in. And I'm not selling that message. It's a word of encouragement. You could be more than you are, and wouldn't that be great for everyone, including you? In my writings and my lectures, I've tried to encourage people to deal with malevolence at the level of the individual, because when you start dealing with it in others, there's a big risk in that. It's like clean up your own right. I've been parodied for that. So, well, look at all the social problems in the world, and Dr. Peterson is telling the oppressed to clean up their rooms. It's like, how is that going to solve anything? It's, well, first of all, have you tried it? Actually, it's not that bloody easy to clean up your room.
Right.
And so
it's harder. It's much easier to clean somebody else's room.
Yes, or it's certainly a lot easier to point to the mess in someone else's room.
Yes.
And there's such a danger. There's such a danger in that, and it's so attractive, right? To localize malevolence externally. It's so attractive because, first of all, it lets you off the hook, and that's a relief. And second, if you've identified malevolence, there's nothing you can do to what is malevolent that's unjustifiable. And so your worst impulses have free reign, because especially if you can also add to that a good cause. You say, well, this is in the service of the eventual utopia. It's like, well, now you have carte blanche for your worst motivations. And that's very, very dangerous. And so I always think that it's better to stick to the psychological.
How do you get people to recognize and then have the courage to stand? You've taken a beating. Nobody wants to do that. Why is that worth it, and how do you get there?
Well, I think it's worth it because I believe the alternative is worse. I mean, that's why I think it's worth it. I think it's a decision that you make to stay silent when you have something to say. You don't know what it is within you that requires your voice, right? Because you feel, I have something to say. It's like, well, where does that come from exactly, that feeling that you have something to say? You're disgruntled at work and you're choking on your own bile because the situation is not just in your estimation. You're dying to say something, but you won't. Well, you'll die if you don't say it. Maybe it's a death of 1,000 cuts. I don't like deferred punishment. I'd rather take it now and keep the future clean, which is why I encourage people to have the fights now. Not to hide things in the fog for later, because they grow and metastasize. It's better to confront what you need to confront when it's small and when you have some possibility of victory.